Okay, welcome back everybody for day 2 of this workshop. So we see you all here bright and early again. There's nothing much to say this morning except for to introduce our first speaker of the day, who is David Krausz from we're going to have to try and pronounce this thing in French, but I'll just say Brussels University. With a talk entitled Unconscious Responsibility on the Gap Between Blame and Responsibility in Psychoanalysis and Talmudic Law. Over to you, David.
Good morning, everybody. Well, can you hear me well? No? Okay. That's okay now? Well, so I'm going to talk today about what I would call unconscious responsibility, which means a kind of alternative or complement to some ideas that have been explored by Hannah Picard and also for the colleagues during this workshop yesterday. So, first of all, introduction. When we judge the acts of a person, whether from a strictly legal point of view or in the common and spontaneous sense, an automatism often leads us to associate responsibility and fault as two inseparable, even indistinct notions. This automatism, according to me, stems from an epistemological point of view, from the assumption that there is only one agency governing the individual and his acts. Based on such an assumption, we establish an automatic connection between responsibility and blame, as indeed we examine an individual's acts. We are forced then to choose between two possibilities, namely, either we attribute the acts to this agency, and by extension, we consider the subject governed by it as both responsible and guilty, blameful, regarding the committed acts, or we consider that the acts are involuntary, so that they cannot be, do not fall within the adjacent agency scope, and consequently, we exempt the subject from any blame, but also from any responsibility for his acts. Hannah Picard observed how clinical work with people suffering from what is called personality disorders defies this paradigm, opening up more complex possibilities to assess responsibility, detaching it from blame, an idea that she theorized in her responsibility without blame paradigm. In our presentation, we intend to explore two sources, one clinical and the other one legal, juridical, which may constitute epistemological basis for such paradigm and maybe to put it in question to some extent. Those sources allow us to move away from the idea of an exclusive agency to a more nuanced subjective conception. The first of these two sources is psychoanalysis' approach to subjective division. For psychoanalysis, no agency can be completely identified with the subject, insofar as something remains in an underlying form behind every word, definition, or act committed by a person. Whether in the first Freudian, what we call topic, which maybe you're familiar to, the idea that subjective activity is divided into conscious, unconscious, and pre-conscious, the famous iceberg schema, or in the second one, the second topic, which is id, ego, and superego. Anyway, different subjective instances or agencies, we could say, are distinguished. Subjective truth appears not as the truth of an authentic underlying, one only authentic underlying instance, but rather the truth of a multiple and perpetual conflict. The subject is not a unity, and consequently its responsibility goes beyond, or maybe we could say underlies below, what is done, said, or thought by his conscious or self aspect, his agency aspect. He is also responsible somehow for his unconscious, even though, of course, he's not guilty or blameful for it. The second source that I'm trying to approach is this legal approach in Talmudic law or Jewish law to the notion of what we call kavanah or intention. In Jewish law, the legal value of some acts, as in common law, by the way, depends on the performer of this act's intention. However, intention does not appear as the secret design of some acute subjective instance, but rather as an ensemble of different kinds of intentions, which do not always actually belong in a proper sense to their holder, to the person who acts. For example, the intention to perform a certain action and the intention to perform through the same action a commandment or a transaction or some different objective, those two differ radically. An individual's declared intention also differ in law from the intentions we attribute him. Similarly, if for some effects the action of a person considered legally incompetent, we'll see that afterwards, can be attributed to this person and thus legally considered as being a human action. For other effects, the same action is not considered an action at all. A person can also, by extension, be considered responsible, but not guilty, not blameful, for involuntary damages or transgressions. The use of these two references that are so diverse, actually, will allow us to further clarify a common point, namely that there are some fundamentals of an ethical approach that takes into account the gap between blame and responsibility, and by these means it is capable of specifying the later one. Responsibility, and particularly the way in which this notion is articulated with both law and therapeutic work, is an extremely vast and complex subject. I do not claim, of course, to address here it exhaustively, but only to clarify an approach that seems to be common to psychoanalysis on the one hand and to Talmudic law's legal approach on the other hand. Identifying this approach can be interesting in the context of our reflection, the object of this workshop, on responsibility and its limits, and particularly concerning responsibility in the medical or psychiatric or therapeutical context. This common approach should be characterized as an analytical approach in the proper sense of the term analysis, which means actually to separate, to break down into parts, to detach links that seem obvious between different elements. If our issue here is the confusion that exists often between blame and responsibility, and thus our difficulty to conceive the later dissociated from the former, it may be enlightening to take the time to separate these concepts from a rigorous point of view, starting from the separation of some of their basic constituent elements. The famous French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, since the very beginning of his work, has always emphasized that if there is something fundamental in Freudian psychoanalysis, it is precisely this approach of a certain decomposition into parts. This decomposition into parts is, first of all, one of the most fundamental characteristics of what we call, and not without reason, an analytical or psychoanalytical process. In a psychoanalysis, differently from what happens in other types of therapy, the issue is not to resolve the conflicts with which a subject is dealing, nor to eliminate them. The task of a psychoanalyst is not to accompany the patient in finding the one authentic answer to a certain question or conflict, an answer that is hidden behind layers and layers of repression and hidden in the depths of mind, or we could say, nor is his task to rid the subject of the symptoms generated by his psychic conflicts, as one would get rid of an unnecessary problem. It is rather a matter of allowing the subject, by means of talking, to distinguish elements which at first seemed indissociable to him, and thus to reduce the dramatic character which is often assumed by psychic conflicts. The conflict is not solved, but deconsolidated. Its character is softened, which usually alleviates, by the way, the subject's symptoms. During an psychoanalysis process, the problem of finding the solution or the right answer to a problem, which frequently obsesses the subject who goes to consult a psychoanalyst, and which contributes, importantly, to produce symptoms and anxiety, this can be transformed generally, by the way, without the subject's knowledge, into something secondary, insofar as he succeeds in accepting his own incoherence and the fact that he is not one single thing, but rather, on the contrary, that contradictions and conflicts are a part of him. Hence, the process of decomposition into parts of which we have talked also concerns, in a more specific way, the very notion of self or ego, as it has been translated from Freud's works, Ich, simply I in German. This notion has a crucial importance in philosophical theory, the notion of self, as well as in general psychology, I mean, pre-psychoanalytic or non-psychoanalytic psychology, which is a discipline that has its origin in the 19th century philosophy and is essentially a philosophical and theoretical current. Contrary to this, Freud did not conceive psychoanalysis at all as a theoretical discipline, but as a practical clinical process and practice. And so, rather than elaborating a consistent theory on what ego is and what is normal functioning, Freud's issue was through empirical encounter with the pathological dimension, problematizing and questioning or even deconsolidating such theories of normality. According to Lacan, if it is possible, as we have said, to deconsolidate psychic conflicts through psychoanalysis, this is due to a shift introduced by Freud, where a theoretical, solid, and unique normal self gives way to a more dynamic conception of personality, we could say, which is essentially based on clinical observation of what is singular in each case. Freudian psychoanalysis does not employ any fixed theoretical standard of normal self in order to approach pathological selves. It is rather a praxis that lets itself be taught by the pathological that it encounters in order to establish case by case its own standard of normality, which actually is always variable and unextendable. Pathology is not seen as a deviation from any established norm, but as the very paradigm of everyday psychic life. Quote Lacan, the new perspectives opened up by Freud were destined to abolish the preceding ones. He's talking about his perspectives on the self. And yet, via innumerable detours, a notion of the ego re-emerged. He's talking about what happened in psychoanalysis after Freud, which is, Lacan says, no way that of Freud's theories. My thesis is that Freud's technique, at its origin, transcends this illusion, which, in a quite concrete manner, has taken hold over the subjectivity of individuals. He's talking about the notion of self. The question, therefore, is whether psychoanalysis will ever so gently allow itself to abandon the different conception that Freud had. The unconscious completely eludes that circle of certainties by which man recognizes himself as an ego. It's very radical and very difficult, this text, but I'll leave it there so that you can read it again and again while I continue. So admittedly, this may seem strange, probably, for those who are used to some post-Freudian versions of psychoanalysis, particularly certain branches that developed in England and the United States after the Second World War and after Freud's death. In some of these branches, precisely, the self is considered to be a supreme standard, the fundamental references for therapeutic work being to center the subject on his autonomous and authentic self, an instance that should ideally take over what the id, the superego, and the external reality are constantly disturbing. It's precisely against this vision that Lacan is talking in this passage. So, however, according to Lacan, who dedicated his second seminar in 1954-1955 to the place of the so-called self or ego, in French, it's translated as moi, which would be the equivalent in English to me. I mean, the I that appears always as object, not as subject. While actually Freud employed the term ich, which is the one who is the subject in the phrase. Lacan, all the time he talks about this notion that developed in post-Freudian psychoanalysis as if the ich about which Freud is talking was the moi, the me, the one that one can talk about it as an object and not this one that is a subject of a phrase, of an enunciation. Well, not extend myself about that. He is critical of the centralization of the analytical approach around the supposedly autonomous self as a completely distortion of what is most essential in Freud's thinking. Another quote. The autonomous ego. This ego, which since the beginning of the Freudian discovery has always been considered as in conflict, is all of a sudden restored to us as a central given. To what inner necessity does the assertion that somewhere there must be an autonomous ego answer? This conviction extends beyond the individual naivety of the subject who believes in himself, who believes that he is himself, a common enough madness, which isn't complete madness because it belongs to the order of beliefs. According to Lacan, if Freud spoke in his second topical of an ego, that is in permanent conflict with the id, the superego, and the external reality, this is in no hypothesis in order to affirm the superiority of an instance over the others, but to put in evidence precisely that the subject is not a unique thing, a single thing. For Lacan, most essential of Freudian theory is to show the fact that the subject is not only one instance, but an anarchic ensemble of separate instances who are in perpetual conflict. What are the implications of these considerations about psychoanalysis on the subject of this intervention, namely the question of responsibility? Our preoccupation here is, of course, not to expose any details of the psychoanalytical approach, but to show how its underlying paradigms may be distinct from the ones we are habitually used to, and this concerning in particular the notion of a consistent self or a unique agency of personality. I want to argue that the automatism we spoke about earlier in the beginning of this presentation, which leads us to associate automatically blame and responsibility, is precisely due to the fact that, unbeknownst to us, we are permanently operating with the very paradigm of self that psychoanalysis seeks to problematize. Because if we actually consider the self as a unique and well-constituted instance, the link between responsibility for one's acts and the attribution of these same acts to the self is evident. To be responsible for something means to be the author of it, which with all of one's person or personality, or at least with the essential part of one's person, namely the self. Following this paradigm, which underlies most of our moral judgments, formal or informal, the equality between blame and responsibility is obvious, insofar as both are related to the attribution of the act to an instance that is, or should be, somehow always conscious, the self. Either we consider the self to be implicated in the act, which renders its author at the same time blameful and responsible for it, or otherwise we consider that the self is not implicated at all, so no blame and no responsibility. However, if we move away from this conception to a fixed self, the automatism may disappear, or at least be nuanced, giving way to a different paradigm. In her responsibility without blame paradigm, Hannah Pickard has noted the practical importance of distinguishing between these two notions from a practical point of view. I quote, "Clinicians most hold service users, mental institution service, most hold service users responsible and accountable for behavior if they are to improve and recover. But blame, in contrast, is highly detrimental," end of quote. As a response to this observation, Pickard proposed that an extension of the domain of responsibility for one's action should be operated in therapeutic contexts. At the same time, she proposes to avoid the subsequent moral judgment that may be attributed to these very actions, through which the individual will be considered then blameful. Thus, the individual is encouraged through the paradigm she proposes to recognize his own actions as belonging to himself, insofar as they derive from conscious choices. I underline conscious choices. A quote, "One is responsible for one's behavior to the degree that one can exercise choice and control over it. End of quote. Blame, on the other hand, as it impairs the efficiency of the therapeutic process, should not be present. Effective clinical treatment presupposes that service users are responsible for their behavior insofar as they have conscious knowledge of what they are doing and can exercise choice at least a degree of control over the behavior. This idea of responsibility is essentially linked not to morality and the reactive attitudes, but to agency. Crucially, in this view, we are responsible for all our actions, whether or not they are right, wrong, or neutral from a moral point of view. We are responsible for our actions because we are their agents. Insofar as we know what we are doing, we can exercise choice and control our behavior. What we do is up to us. This paradigm can undoubtedly contribute to an effective and ethical therapeutic model. However, in the light of the present reflection on the self issue, I would like to point out an ethical problem it may imply. If Picard proposes, through her analysis, to separate the moral field from simple action theory, namely to distinguish blame from responsibility, she still maintains, on the other hand, a strong connection between responsibility and choice or free will, and hence to agency by extension to the self. Based on the psychoanalytical theoretical reference we have seen, I would like to propose that this connection may also be problematized. Moreover, if it is not the case, that may suddenly become a very dangerous paradigm from an ethical point of view. In the extension of the domain of responsibility, if the extension of the domain of responsibility does not comprehend also actions that cannot be qualified as willful or voluntary, and thus that do not fall within the domain of what could be classically considered as the self, this would mean that to enlarge responsibility's domain equals to enlarge consciousness or awareness domain. If responsibility does not also include the conscious and unconscious dimension, those actions that escape to the subject's control, as well as his untamable, irreducible, troublesome sides, then, if it doesn't include that, the paradigm of responsibility without blame is transformed into a permanent injunction to awareness and control, an imperative on the subject to reduce himself somehow to his conscious self, and to submit any parts of him that cling to his symptoms, for example, as if they were not actually parts of him, but only an adversary to fight. The consequences of such injunctions may be catastrophic, since, at least from a psychoanalytical point of view, involuntary action and thinking also contain a dimension of subjective truth, certainly not less than conscious activity. If, on the contrary, we extend the separation operation proposed by Picard to a more radical level, holding a subject responsible also for the ensemble of his willful action, but also for his unconscious dimension and involuntary actions, injunction to control and denial of any irrational thinking or acting may give place to a more nuanced paradigm. Considering responsibility an intention and agency issue, what associates it to the idea of an autonomous self perpetuates a conception according to which responsibility and the self, on the one hand, and unconscious activity, on the other hand, are adversaries. Whereas promoting responsibility as something that goes beyond the intention may open to practitioners the possibility to accompany each patient in his own singular way to compose and deal not with agency and its adversaries, but rather with a complex constellation of agencies. To better illustrate this point, namely the possibility to hold someone responsible in spite of a lack of intention, we will have recourse to another theoretical source from a completely different field, law, in which we can observe this same tendency to move away from a unique self or personality agency model towards a paradigm that somehow breaks the self into parts. We will see that in Talmudic law, there is a constant concern to distinguish different types of acts and the extent to which they can be attributed to a person. Talmudic law establishes as well different levels according to which one can be responsibilized and blamed for them. We are used to a paradigm in which acts, responsibility, and blame are all attributed together in a binary way, either yes or no, according to the possibility of linking them to the one instance of a supposed self. Talmudic legal literature, however, through its principles and mainly through the exploration of extreme or borderline cases, proposes much more nuanced paradigms which permit this attribution process to be diffracted. We could exemplify this affirmation from virtually every area of Jewish law, as we almost invariably see how Talmudic reflection establishes a clear gap between different levels of intentionality in and behind a person's actions. This is true concerning the laws of damage and compensation, crimes and misdemeanors, marriages and divorces, contracts and labor relations, but also concerning the rules governing sacrifices that were offered in the temple, ritual purity and impurity, prayer, writing of documents, making of ritual utensils, etc., etc. It is recurrent that the sages of the Talmud dedicate an important part of their minutiae debates to specifying the limits of what, for legal effects, is considered as an action or a deed, and very often this is a function of the different degrees of intentionality implied in these actions. Knowing that this is an extremely broad topic, which goes far beyond the scope of this kind of talk, I would like to present you a specific case to illustrate our point, and we'll finish on this. This case might clarify how Jewish law operates a separation into parts and analyzes in this approach to the self, or at least to the element of intentionality that this notion of self entails. We will examine a text from the Mishnah, the oldest textual corpus of what we can properly call Jewish law, or at least rabbinic law, compiled in the 2nd century of Common Era. The Mishnah is the first extract of the so-called oral Torah, which deals with the details of the application of the written Torah according to its accompanying oral tradition. Specifically, this passage is the very beginning of the last chapter of the tractate called Marshilim, a tractate whose object is the status of ritual purity or impurity that certain foods may acquire by their eventual contact with other agents or substances, rules which are briefly stated in the chapter 11 of Leviticus. It should be noted that this kind of impurity disqualifies these foods from being consumed or used by the priest in certain sacred contexts, which we will not specify here. It should also be noted that the theme of this tractate is apparently unrelated to the subject of intentionality or the limits of responsibility, but it is typical in rabbinic literature, which is not theoretical, theological, or philosophical, but fundamentally juridical. The theoretical issues are raised discreetly and, by the way, in the nuances of technical discussions of the cases presented, which are often extreme or even inapplicable. Let us come to our text. The rules which are set out in it concerning what may or may not render a food, as I said, impure, derive from the following verses of Leviticus. The following shall be impure for you from among the things that swarm on the earth: the mole, the mouse, the great lizards of every variety, the gecko and the crocodile, the lizard, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Those are for you impure among the swarming things. Whoever touches them when they are dead shall be impure until evening. And then we come to our point. If such a carcass of one of these creatures falls upon seed grain that is to be sown, it is pure. But if water is poured on the seed and any part of a carcass falls upon it, it shall be impure for you. The Bible teaches that the bodies of certain species of animals considered impure have the power to make anyone who touches them also impure. The same is true of certain utensils. However, in the case of fruits and seeds, the simple contact does not transmit the impurity. The condition for it to be transmitted is that water was poured on it before contact with the animal's carcass. From a grammatical precision in the biblical text, the sages of the Mishnah learn that, that in order to be considered as such that can transmit impurity, the water must be poured on the seed or fruit by a person, and this must be done in an intentional way. This rule is known as Kiyutan law, or the law of if water is poured. In order to clarify this rule, which is related to intentionality issue, the Mishnah examines a rather singular case. One who carries his produce of seeds or fruit up to the roof because of maggots, namely to protect them, not to wet them, and dew came down upon it, it does not come under the law of if water is poured. But if he intended for this to happen, it does come under the law of if water is poured. Up to this point, the Mishnah specifies exactly what the conditions are for it to be considered that a person poured water on the seed. In other words, the conditions necessary for us to attribute the action of pouring water to an individual. We might think that this is obvious, but when we think about it, we soon realize that it is not the case. For example, we might think that the movement of the actor is necessary to attribute an action to him. In our case, it would be necessary, for example, that the person would actually pour a glass of water on the fruit. The first thing that the Mishnah teaches us is that, contrary to this intuition, even when the person does not make any direct movement, the person simply places the fruit on the roof and thinks about the fact that it will be wet, his intention can be sufficient for the action of pouring water to be attributed to him. The conditioning being that his intention should be associated with the movement, in the case, the movement of the dew. In this case, in order to examine to what extent thought or intention may indeed constitute an action, the Mishnah makes use of the cases of another case, the cases of the madman, the deaf mute, and the minor, a triad of juridical characters, we will see that, which rabbinic literature usually employs as borderline cases of people who are considered to lack what is called da'at, a term which can be translated as discernment, reason, conscience, or intention. The Mishnah continues the same case with a new variation, that if the action in question, whose very status as an intention of human action was the subject of the precedent, which was present of the subject of the precedent debate, what if this action is performed by a person to whom we cannot, as a matter of principle, attribute any intention? That's the case we will see. If a deaf mute or a madman or a minor carried it up to the roof, although he expected the Jew should come upon it, it does not come under the law of if water be cold, because these, the deaf mute, the madman, and the minor, are considered as capable of performing acts, but not capable of having intentions. This triad of characters appears here as the borderline case from which we can examine more accurately what constitutes an action and what constitutes intention. This case permits us to see, the precedent case of a normal person permits us to see the limits of action, arguing that no active movement is actually necessary for an action to be attributed to someone. A mere thought being sufficient to, in some cases, to make such an attribution. The case of the deaf mute, the madman, and the minor serves in some way to better clarify what kind of intention was necessary then, to qualify more precisely this kind of intention, which in its own can be considered as an act. How do we qualify this kind of intention that we circumscribe in a negative way as the kind of intention that this triad lacks? How does it differ from other types of intention? Yeah, okay, I'll finish in 3 minutes. The Mishnah justifies the fact that these people's thinking about wetting the fruit is not enough for us to consider as if they had actually poured water on it as follows, because it's written, yeah, because they are considered as capable of performing acts, but not capable of having intention. Here we arrive to our point. This means that in the case this triad, which are considered not to lack intention, if they had actually intentionally poured water on the fruit, in spite of the fact that systematically we don't consider they have any intention, we would attribute them the act. Namely, the intention that accompanies an act can be attributed to them, but the sole intention of thinking about cannot. From this, we arrive to a crucial distinction. We have on one hand the simple intention that directly accompanies an action, and on the other hand, the intention that something should happen. This distinction is very important in juridical thought, and the use of the case of this triad helps us to clarify this. Well, this is of course only a small illustrative example to give you a taste of how the question of intentionality is approached in rabbinic law. Even though it does not properly addresses the responsibility issue itself, dealing mainly with the more basic questions of simple intentionality definition and acts attribution, it may be quite clarifying for us. For by the means of the extreme operation of separation into parts, rather than limiting our judgment to the binarity between intentional or non-intentional acts as a function of their attribution or not, to a consistent self-instance, here again we can constate a dissolution of such a notion. Talmudic exploration of the intention levels that still exist for a person who is considered by principle as lacking of any intention reflects a much more nuanced self-paradigm, which actually makes abstraction of the agency notion in order to analyze each element, namely each kind of intention, separately. As various types and levels of intentionality are identified, responsibility may also be detached from the classical intentional factor. One can be rendered, in some cases, responsible for acts committed unintentionally, and conversely may be considered exempt from some kinds of responsibility in spite of one's intention. I hope the second part of my presentation was clear enough, in spite of its technical and minutious character. I hope it could render more concrete what I mean by responsibility beyond self and agency, as well as the model I proposed, model in which practitioners should not be bound to any supposed and theoretical agency or self, but rather open to accompany each patient in his own singular way to compose and deal with a complex underlying constellation of agencies. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll just take a very short 30-second pause, gather our thoughts, catch your breath, and then we'll move to Q&A.
What?
I'm going to do Q&A myself. I've got to.
Oh, okay.
So just ignore that.
Thank you.
Okay. So as yesterday, we'll use a hand finger system. If you have a substantive question, raise a hand and keep it up until I sort of give you a nod. I'll add you to the queue. If you have a follow-up question, then just raise a finger. And let's start in front of them.
Thank you. And so thanks for letting me kick this off. So I have, I guess, a lot of sort of related ideas, and I'll frame it in the form of a question. I guess as you're talking, and I see why you want to connect intentionality to the self. One thing I'm thinking of is, well, what about really different conceptions of the self, like in Buddhism, for instance, where there's no self, like can we then have no responsibility or blame, or if you've considered that. But another thought is about your conception of intentionality and what an intention is, and whether you're thinking intentions necessarily have to be conscious, why you think intentions necessarily need to be conscious, and maybe to suggest thinking about or looking at the literature on skill, which also deals a lot in not the unconscious in the Freudian way, but the unconscious automatic, but still, you know, so if you think about an intent, like my intention to reach, say, for my phone right now, the intention is to reach for my phone. I don't have an intention to exactly control, for instance, the particular sort of kinesthetic degrees of freedom in each of my fingers, my elbow, my shoulder, right? But that's still an action, right? That's still something I'm doing, right? And so there might be also kind of just different ways, I think, of maybe thinking of intention, and perhaps it's a dual question. Why do we have to go to self? But also, in what way do you conceive of intention that
Well, I didn't try to make any comprehensive lecture about all different ways of seeing what the self is or what intention is. And of course, this is a theme that is vastly explored in literature, especially in analytical philosophy, Anscombe's work, for example. What I wanted to point out is mainly that there is a certain vulgar conception of self and of intention that is underlying very often the judgments that we do. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons that analytical philosophy gets interested by explore and in a broader way also law philosophy of law tries to explore that. But for example, one thing that seems to me very interesting was what Adi Godiner talked about yesterday when she showed the law texts regarding disabilities and what the decisions of the court were in spite of this law. I think this is a good case to show what precisely what I wanted to point out. I mean, that we may distinguish some things from a theoretical point of view, as it's the case in law and philosophy of law and analytical philosophy, action theory, etc., etc., etc. But still, there is in our moral judgments some very, and this is what Lacan tries to say, right? That there is a very naive way to face what intention is, what self is, that is underlying our judgments, and the ones which are the most important ones, because they are not reflected ones. And what I wanted to point out is that this is an underlying instance, and it is very important to question it, whether we can question it by psychoanalysis and by Talmudic law, as I did, but of course, action theory is also a way to explore this, and yes, I mean, it's a very vast domain, and in my opinion, a very important domain, not enough taken seriously.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. So it's one way in which to undermine this naive notion that isn't the way that others have, but similarly might get to the same end. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I should just say quickly to those joining online, if you have a question, you can either use the raise hand function or put a Q in the question in the chat if you'd like to say your own question, or if you type a question into the chat and then when we come to it, we'll just be able to read it out. Okay.
So thank you, David. I have a question about the sort of logical structure of your argument, as I understand it. So the first part is using two different traditions to point out that there's a metaphysical mistake we often make about autonomous agency or everything being self-initiated. And another one is a kind of epistemic mistake that's related, that we often think in monocausal terms, or we overrate the proximate cause, like the fact that someone did something isn't sufficient to prove that they, as it were, did it in the strong action sense. Okay, so that's the first part of the argument, and I accept both aspects. I think they're really important, and an interesting question is, why doesn't common culture pick up on some of these problems about monocausation in particular? But the second part of your argument, though, then moves to the responsibility without blame sort of view. And I just think that that doesn't follow as quickly, but you didn't have enough time to lay out the whole argument. So here's some thoughts. I think what the first part of the argument does, in my view, would be it completely complexifies all attitudes we have, like regret, remorse, guilt, shame, blame, excuses, how much a person is responsible. But Hannah's paper, Responsibility Without Blame, it just makes the obvious point in a particular case. So I'm asking you about this. She says people with personality disorders, it causes a lot of trouble if you blame them. There's no reason to blame them. The causal history is way too complicated to blame them for causing a personality disorder. But it doesn't follow that our blaming practices are all off, or that so for example, if a child, young David, doesn't share the Legos with his sister, or and hits her when she takes the Legos. So mommy says, David, don't do that. You ought not to do that. Well, she's blaming you for your activity, and she's saying you are responsible going forward to not do that again. And if you do that again, I will blame you again. So I think it's tricky about what in the sphere of what we're talking about, addictions, therapeutic practice, what one does in particular cases. I'm looking at the evidence about, so my question for you is this. You said blame is highly detrimental.
I didn't say that. That's Hannah.
Well, she means it's highly detrimental in the case of blaming people with personality disorders for having disorders. Nothing really follows about practices of blame in general. It just depends on the case, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So nothing follows about this responsibility without blame thesis being generally useful to us.
For sure.
Okay. Well, I thought part of your argument was
No,
to,
but my point was not to discuss the blame part. It was to discuss the responsibility part. Anyway, what she does I completely agree with your reading. I mean, it's to separate these two dimensions and to say in some cases, from a practical point of view, responsibilizing someone is useful and important, while blaming is detrimental. And so in this context, we should apply this paradigm. It doesn't mean, of course, that blame is something that should not exist. What I concentrated my intervention on was on the point of the vision on responsibility itself, leaving apart the issue of blame, which of course I think we cannot disagree with you. I mean, law, even as a psychologist, I would say that how important is law and blaming for some people, right? I mean, it's case by case, for sure. Right?
Hopefully just be to clarify things. One, I was wondering about the way you were describing therapy as something that should help a person decompose things that they might have kind of inflated and help them appreciate perhaps the multiple agencies that are driving them and not kind of assuming there's a single agency, which seems, I'm sure that could be helpful, but I was wondering, isn't there also a role to help people unify sometimes and bring things together that they, particularly I'm thinking in terms of practical agency and addiction as being maybe one of the basic cases of that, where you could say you've got a split between two quite strongly developed agencies, one just keen to keep using drugs and one who's prefer to reduce drug intake in order to pursue other values. And isn't this a case where the therapy should be actually trying to encourage the adversarial approach, if you like, which is probably to have the drug using person win out, but even if it was the drug using person, that would at least mean that there's an inconsistency that was resolved.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you think about that? Were you committed to one or the other, or
I think your question is very good and it deserves a very good answer, which I am not sure I am the most qualified person to give you. Lacan consecrated the following seminary more or less to this question precisely. I mean, if in his second seminary he's occupied all the time with the issue of questioning post-Freudian vision on the self, or on the ego that developed, according to him, against what was Freud's original vision. In the following seminar, he conceptualized, already in this one and in the following, he conceptualized how this notion, this very notion of self, is, we cannot exist without it. But it is very different. That's why I say your question is very good. It is very different to say there is such an instance, and it's just a matter of assessing it, or there is no such instance, and it is a construction, but a necessary construction. So to answer to your question, of course, in some cases, the therapeutical process means to get a very well constituted imaginary instance, namely the self, and shake it around a little bit and say, well, maybe it's not all that. And in other cases, it's the other way around. To get a patient that is completely, how can I say, dispersated and chaotic, and try to construct with him some maybe not very strong, but still some point of support around an imaginary instance of self. So this is the fundamental distinction between what is a therapeutical process for a neurotic patient or for a psychotic patient. But this is a very broad subject, and well,
lots more to discuss, I think, but that does take us to time. So let's just thank the speaker once again, Dave.